Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, To Speak or Not to Speak, Skepticism in the Zhuangzi. As we now turn to our second great classic of Warring States Daoism, the Zhuangzi, it would be appropriate to do something unexpected. It is, after all, one of the most consistently and delightfully surprising texts in all of global philosophy. So we're going to start with, of all people, Oscar Wilde. As it happens, in 1890, he published a review of what was then a New English translation of the Zhuangzi, which must rate as one of the most entertaining reviews ever written of a book of Chinese philosophy. It starts strong. Zhuangzi, whose name must carefully be pronounced as it is not written, was born in the 4th century before Christ by the banks of the Yellow River in the Flowery Land, and portraits of the wonderful sage seated on the flying dragon of contemplation may still be found on the simple tea trays and pleasing screens of many of our most respectable suburban households. If they really knew who he was, they would tremble. Towards the end of the review, Wilde sums up, "It is clear that Zhuangzi is a very dangerous writer, and the publication of his book in English, 2,000 years after his death, is obviously premature, and may cause a great deal of pain to many thoroughly respectable and industrious persons." Being who he was, Wilde naturally delighted in the social critique, iconoclasm, and wit of the Zhuangzi. As both of these passages suggest, he richly enjoyed the thought of his Victorian contemporaries being shaken up by it. Wilde was also alive to the philosophical nuance of the work. He compares Zhuangzi to a range of European thinkers, including Plato, Dionysius, Eriugena, Meister Eckhart, and Jakob Böhme, and competently explains several key ideas in this Taoist masterpiece, for example that true wisdom can neither be learned nor taught. Knowledge is shallow if we compare it with the extent of the unknown, and only the unknowable is of value. That makes the work sound thoroughly skeptical. Yet Wilde also remarks that in a simpler, archaic time, envisioned in the Zhuangzi, when people's natures had not yet been disrupted by interference from governments and philosophers, every man kept his knowledge to himself, so the world escaped the curse of skepticism. It's debatable whether the Zhuangzi really endorses the idea of returning to the state of nature, but Wilde at least put his finger on a key interpretive problem about the Zhuangzi's skepticism. Is this a skeptical text? If so, what sort of skepticism is at stake? There can be no doubt that the Zhuangzi is at least skeptical when it comes to the teachings of other philosophers from the time. It pours scorn on the useless distinctions of experts in debate, naming and shaming Mozi and Yangzi and their followers, whose constraining doctrines make them like caged birds bound by heavy cords. The dialectician Huizi, often characterized as a logician of sorts, plays an especially important role, a kind of philosophical straight man who is refuted by Zhuangzi in several passages. On the other hand, the moving passage shows Zhuangzi lamenting after Huizi's death, since now he will have no one with whom to try out his own ideas. Similarly, Kongzi and Gongsun are both shown encountering and being outmatched by Taoist sages. Gongsun is humiliated by Zhuangzi and Kongzi by Laozi himself. Full of chagrin at this encounter, Kongzi is made to admit, "In relation to Tao, I am no better than a pickled insect in a vat of vinegar." We'll have much more to say in a later episode about the role of Kongzi in this work, because he has a rather ambiguous status, sometimes seeming to voice the Zhuangzi's own doctrines, sometimes appearing as a less insightful contrast to Zhuangzi. Even the sage kings Yao and Shun come in for criticism. It was thanks to the efforts of kings like them, and also the pernicious influence of the Mohists and Confucians, that natural human tendencies were disrupted. In other words, the ideas that the Confucians and other thinkers saw as the solution to the problems of Warring States China were, for the Zhuangzi, precisely the root of those problems. One of the earliest sources to comment on the text is the historian Sima Qian, who placed the Zhuangzi into a narrative of interschool rivalry. He wrote that Zhuangzi sought to defame and refute the disciples of Kongzi and to elucidate the arts of Laozi. We've spoken before about the potentially misleading nature of Sima Qian's narrative, which seeks to put thinkers neatly into well-defined and competing traditions. But it's true enough that the Zhuangzi is critical of other thinkers, indeed pretty well all the other thinkers we've mentioned in this whole series so far. It's also true that Zhuangzi is presented as a follower of Lao Tzu. Numerous passages refer to Lao Tzu, always in positive terms, and the text of the Lao Tzu, or Dao De Jing, is quoted verbatim. Still, one would struggle to find other Warring States texts that name Zhuangzi as a champion of Taoism, and not only because Taoism was not a well-defined school at this stage. It's also because Zhuangzi is hardly mentioned at all in these early texts, the main exception being a passage in Xunzi that says Zhuangzi was fixated on the heavenly and did not understand the value of the human. We'll come back to this harsh judgment. While that passage does seem to confirm that Zhuangzhu, or Zhuangzi, meaning Master Zhuang, was a real person, he doesn't have much historical presence in our sources. He is thus known to us almost exclusively as the author of the work that bears his name, if, that is, he was its author. A traditional assumption is that he wrote at least the so-called inner chapters, the first 7 chapters of the work that has come down to us. This core of inner chapters is followed by the outer chapters, and then the mixed or miscellaneous chapters, all of which have traditionally been seen as the work of followers or admirers of Zhuangzi. On this assumption, one might say that the first 7 chapters should be at the center of scholarly focus, with the remainder treated as supplementary material. But the traditional view of the text composition has been seriously challenged, especially by Esther Klein, who has argued that the inner chapters did not circulate as a unit in the Warring States period. Some parts were most likely written later, though one cannot exclude that they also contain original material. The version of the Zhuangzi that is most commonly read derives from an edition by Guo Xiang, who lived from 252 to 312 CE. That's rather unsettling. Zhuangzi supposedly lived in the late 4th century BCE, that is more than half a millennium before Guo Xiang. By his own testimony, Guo Xiang heavily edited the text, reorganizing its passages. The previous version is said to have had 51 chapters, from which he made a 33-chapter version, in the process excluding material that seemed to him extraneous, like folkloristic discussions of dreams, magic, and the like. Like any scholar, Guo Xiang, as editor, had his own agenda. He was particularly interested in what the Zhuangzi had to say about the connection of man with the universe through his inner nature aligned with cosmic share and his fate corresponding to cosmic principle, as one scholar has put it. It's hard to tell what we've lost from the Zhuangzi through Guo Xiang's editorial labors. One might assume that 18 whole chapters have been lost from the original 51, but even this isn't certain, as some of the material could have been incorporated into his 33-chapter version. The upshot is that it's unclear whether we should prioritize the inner chapters over the rest of the Zhuangzi. Besides which, Guo Xiang's version has been the basis for the study of the Zhuangzi. After all, the text itself is only a part of the Zhuangzian tradition, which also includes the commentaries that tell us how to read and interpret it. So going forward, we're not going to confine ourselves to the 7 inner chapters, but allow ourselves to draw on the whole text. Nonetheless, we do want to begin with chapter 2, which is among the inner chapters, because it has so much to say on that question of skepticism. It is entitled Equalizing Assessments of Things, which neatly gets across one of its themes, that different, even conflicting points of view on the world are somehow balanced or of equal standing. Perhaps the clearest statement of the idea in this chapter reads, each thing necessarily has some place from which it can be affirmed as thus and so, and some place from which it can be affirmed as acceptable. So, no thing is not right, no thing is not acceptable. A vivid example is provided using the demonstrative pronouns this and that. Suppose you see me carrying a book and ask, what's that? I might say, oh, it's an Oscar Wilde novel. For you, the book is that. For me, it's this. And we're both right. Of course, that example doesn't by itself establish the far more dramatic claims just noted that no thing is not right, no thing is not acceptable. But it's suggestive of what the Zhuangzi might mean, namely that different claims make sense from different points of view. The Zhuangzi cleverly uses indexical terms such as this and that to indicate that people see things from specific points of view. Indexical terms are pointer words. Their meanings depend on the objects they refer to in a given context. Another example would be the word I, which refers to whichever person uses it to indicate themselves on a given occasion. Thus, difference in perspective can be relevant to far more momentous questions like, who am I? Which brings us to the most famous passage of the work, which comes at the end of this chapter. Zhuangzi dreams that he is a butterfly. Upon waking, He did not know if he had been dreaming he was a butterfly or if a butterfly was now dreaming it was him. Given the similarity between this example and other skeptical arguments that invoke dreaming, like the one used by Descartes at the beginning of his Meditations, it's tempting to see the butterfly passage as an attempt to show that, in general, nothing can ever be certain. In a later episode devoted to life and death in the Zhuangzi, though, we'll suggest that the butterfly passage is not really raising a general skeptical concern, but rather addressing the problem of identity. And more generally, the Zhuangzi doesn't really seem to be focused on showing that we can never be certain about anything. Rather, the dream example, like the this and that example, draws attention to the way that individual perspectives are in themselves valid, while also being limited. This may recall the Lao Tzu's attitude towards the many Daos that fall short of being eternal, or its dismissal of the lists of 5 colors, flavors, tones, and so on, as mere attempts to limit what is in itself unlimited. And, by the way, that passage is one that gets picked up by the Zhuangzi not once but twice. The Zhuangzi also shares the Lao Tzu's concerns about language and its tendency to narrow our viewpoint on the world. Thus, in that same second chapter, the question is posed, what speech refers to is particularly unfixed, so is there really anything it speaks of? Perhaps all language is just like the chirping of baby birds. This remark would have been directed at people who argued that they had the correct definitions of what society should ideally be like, and of specific kinds of human achievements that ought to be promoted. Such people believe there is only one correct way to understand what is valuable or worthy, and their ideas are based on definitions of virtue and worth. For the Zhuangzi, such people are simply clinging to their own perspective. Similarly, the Zhuangzi sees the use of language to win debates as fruitless, because any debate is just a clash of unreconcilable viewpoints. Must one of us be right and the other wrong? Asked the Zhuangzi. Or could both of us be right, or both of us wrong? There's no way to decide, since both of us are party to the debate and are thus disqualified from judging, and any other judge who can be involved would have their own axe to grind. Some interpreters have tried to tame the Zhuangzi's skepticism by limiting it only to a certain domain, like the meanings of words or the realm of evaluation and ethical action. But this doesn't fit with the wide range of examples found in the text. The butterfly example, for instance, is not just about language or evaluation, and the reasons given for thinking that debate is undecidable have nothing to do with the subject of the debate. But if we take the Zhuangzi to be making a more generally skeptical point, what would that point be? The most radical possibility would be that it simply rejects all truth claims, regardless of topic. Whatever anyone thinks or says about anything would be wrong, or rather, no more right than wrong. Some passages in the Zhuangzi counsel a kind of abstinence from all judgments, which could support such a radical view. In chapter 4, there's an extraordinary dialogue between Kongzi and his disciple Yan Hui about the best way to convert a tyrant. We'll need to return to it in a later episode, but for now we just want to flag Kongzi's advice that Yan Hui should engage in fasting of the mind so as to achieve a kind of vacuity. This can be connected to the Lao Tzu's idea of being like an uncarved piece of wood, an image that is evoked in the Zhuangzi as well. It also alludes to the newborn infant as a paradigm of the Taoist attitude, as in this passage, when you divest yourself of small wisdom, the great wisdom dawns. When you get rid of the idea of goodness, goodness spontaneously emerges. Infants are born and, without apprenticing themselves to any teacher, they become speakers of their native language, just by remaining there in the company of those who can speak it. From all these texts, then, we might take the idea that the Zhuangzi wants us to empty our minds of all ideas and opinions, learning to be happy in a profound and peaceful ignorance. That would explain why knowledge, Xu, is so often mentioned only to be undermined. Lao Tzu is shown admitting his lack of knowledge, and pretensions to knowledge are frequently mocked. Everyone in the world knows enough to find out about what they don't know, but none knows enough to find out about what they already know. Or take this inimitably Zhuangzian remark, not knowing is knowing is not knowing, who knows the knowing of not knowing? Yet there are problems with this line of interpretation. For one thing, we might wonder about the Zhuangzi itself. Are its claims likewise neither right nor wrong? One way out of this problem would be to take its teaching to be purely negative and critical, and indeed the Zhuangzi is often negative and critical, but it also seems to approve of some attitudes and some kinds of knowledge. A primary example is the mastery of practical skills like carpentry or swimming. Again, we'll be devoting a whole episode to the so-called skill stories of the Zhuangzi, which seem to show that there can at least be knowing how, if not knowing that. Some scholars have thus suggested that such practical knowing is the only kind of knowledge admitted by the Zhuangzi. Yet the work also seems to hold out the prospect of other, elevated ways of grasping the world, those that it labels with the term great knowledge. Besides, a certain way of seeing things could be limited and not the final word on the matter at hand, but still have a lot going for it. Remember the case of this and that. From your perspective, the book in my hand really is over there, so it makes sense to call it that. Whereas it's in my hand, so for me, it makes sense to call it this. Likewise, any suggestion that language is pervasively rejected by the Zhuangzi would have to reckon with the fact that the Zhuangzi's ideas are, themselves, expressed in language. Its authors must have thought there is something useful one can do with words, even if they do question whether the Tao itself can be put into words, so that only where there is neither speech nor silence does discussion really come to its ultimate end. So here is a less dramatic take on the skepticism of the Zhuangzi. Maybe it is saying that the world is understood from limited perspectives, each of which does contribute something, but none of which is definitive. Or perhaps some perspectives really are to be discarded completely. The Zhuangzi seems, for instance, to find the Moist or Yangist view of things wholly unhelpful. But still, there are many outlooks that are valuable, even if they don't align or agree with one another. Here too, we find plenty of material in the Zhuangzi to support the proposed interpretation. In chapter 17, we are told that there is a perspective from which the tip of a hair is huge, and one from which mountain ranges are small. On the following page, we get an echo of that remark from chapter 2 that no thing is not right. If we judge something to be right because there is some way to view it as right, then no thing is not right. The Zhuangzi says that it speaks only non-speech, not because nothing is worth saying, but because there is some place from which each saying is acceptable and some place from which it is unacceptable. In some cases, one and the same person may come to occupy multiple perspectives, as with the story of Lady Li. She was forced to marry a king and wept bitter tears, but then changed her mind when she realized the life of luxury she would enjoy from then on. While this could be taken to show that there just is no right or wrong, a view similar to the radical skepticism we considered earlier, we take the story to support what philosophers call perspectivism. The lesson is to be open to what is good about each perspective, while also seeing that each perspective is only that, a certain perspective. This would be a corrective to the usual assumption that there is just one privileged way of seeing the world. As scholar David Wang remarks, we presume that at most one perspective can be right about how things are, and yet we are unable to show, not just to others, but also to ourselves, why we are more justified in holding our perspective. Appropriately enough, this allows a different perspective on the more critical and negative passages we mentioned earlier, about learning to embrace ignorance and so on. Perhaps they are not gesturing towards radical skepticism, but serve as a kind of therapy for readers, easing them away from dogmatic attachment to views that they hold to the exclusion of any other view. Indeed, sometimes the Zhuangzi explicitly seems to be counseling nothing more than a kind of epistemic modesty. What a person knows is far less than what they do not know. Or in more convoluted terms, everyone esteems what his knowing knows, but no one knows how to know only by relying on what his knowing does not know. But mightn't there be some one favored perspective, the final Taoist point of view, that somehow trumps, includes, or transcends all others? Is this what the Zhuangzi means by great knowledge? The opening of the very first chapter could suggest this. It tells the story of a fish that transforms into an enormous bird called Pang. It has a body measuring thousands of miles and can fly so high that the sky above it and ground below look the same to it. A cicada and dove mock this enormous bird in its very different ways. The text editorializes, what do these two little insects know? A small consciousness cannot keep up with a vast consciousness. The morning mushroom knows nothing of the noontide. The winter cicada knows nothing of the spring and autumn. Reading this, one certainly feels tempted to emulate the Pang bird and not the cicada and dove, especially if one remembers that the Lao Tzu mentions small-minded people who laugh when they hear the Tao, as these tiny creatures are doing. But we probably shouldn't leap to the assumption that the Pang bird's perspective is somehow the right one. The bird may indeed represent the large consciousness, which is idle and spacey, whereas a small consciousness is cramped and circumspect. Yet the bird can see nothing but the endless, hazy blue of the sky, which may or may not even be its true color. There's a lot the Peng bird is missing, things that are evident to the cicada and dove. So, much as we suggested that the Lao Tzu offers no one Tao that is correct, no best Tao that defeats all the others, so we would tend to agree with interpreters who recognize a kind of value pluralism in the Zhuangzi. Among them is our recent interview guest, Chris Fraser. He agrees that the Zhuangzi does identify an all-encompassing perspective that is no particular perspective at all, but argues that, if anything, the text mocks attempts to adopt this point of view and reject all others. Rather, reorganizing or acting on one value from one perspective entails passing over other potential values or perspectives. Similarly, we may again quote David Wong, who has said that for the Zhuangzi, every coherent ethic cuts out something of genuine value. Bearing in mind the earlier point that the Zhuangzi is interested not only in ethical examples and evaluative attitudes, we can generalize this insight to say that the authors of the work were willing to deem any number of perspectives on all manner of topics as acceptable, while also recognizing that other contrary perspectives are likewise acceptable. This reading would give us a position crucially different from both radical skepticism and relativism. Radical skepticism undermines all perspectives, showing them to be doubtful or untenable. Relativism states that each perspective is valid for the person who holds that view. Pluralism or perspectivism, by contrast, would open a way, a Tao, for better understanding the world, without assuming we know it all. If we understand the Zhuangzi to be offering a perspectivist view, we might also see that its skepticism is not aimed at proving that we cannot know anything. Rather, its point is that we cannot know anything so objectively and certainly that we'd want to prescribe it for everyone. We will see in a later episode how taking on different perspectives is a method the Zhuangzi promotes and itself uses as it gets its readers to imagine and consider points of view that are not their own. To do this is to engage in the activity of wandering, a topic we'll consider later. The Zhuangzi uses wandering as a philosophical strategy in its argument against those who dogmatically insist that there's just one way humans should live their lives. By reading the Zhuangzi, we learn not to cling to our own views tightly and defensively. But of course, that's only one perspective on the Zhuangzi. As its authors might say, how do we know which interpretation is right and which is wrong? Is it only us who are so stupid? Well, it might help to think more about that very contrast between right and wrong, and what the Zhuangzi does have to say about evaluative decisions. That's what we'll do in the next episode. If hearing about that is wrong, then you don't want to be right. You just want to join us again for the next episode of The History of Philosophy in China.